Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for literature and coping skills. I'm back with another lecture for you, and this time I'm going to talk about death anxiety. If you remember, I talked about the fear and anxiety factors in my last two lectures. If you have followed those lectures closely, you might have construed that death anxiety and decision-making anxiety will follow those ideas naturally. So today I'm going to talk about death anxiety. Let's take a quick look at what are the things that I'm going to focus on in this lecture. I'm going to focus on the fear of death. I talked about fear, the psychology of fear, and also the neurobiology of fear in my last lecture. So I'm going to focus on a specific type of fear, that is the fear of death today. I'm also going to extend that fear to death anxiety so that we understand its clinical dimensions and its neurobiological dimensions. I'm also going to focus on Thanatophobia, a very different kind of phobia that is involved with death. I'm also going to focus on thinking about death, how we think about death and how that affects our everyday functioning. And then I'll also be talking about death be not proud. As you all know, from this lecture we are going to focus on specific literary compositions, especially poetic compositions, in order to understand how these compositions can help us with certain coping skills and coping strategies. So, Death Be Not Proud by Donne is the poetic composition that I have picked to show how this particular composition can teach us wonderful coping skills. And then I'll be focusing on those coping strategies that are brought out in Death Be Not Proud, so that we learn how to discern such poetic compositions which offer great insights into coping skills and coping strategies. And with the help of such literary texts or compositions, we can develop such coping skills in us as well. So these are some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So let's take a quick look at each of these elements, and as I walk you through these elements, I'll be focusing on the intricate, complex, and the important dimensions of each of these elements. So let's start. So we'll start with fear of death. Now this is a kind of fear that we all are hounded by. If we have to think about or prepare a list of the things that we fear, we'll definitely find that the fear of death is the most distressing, most disturbing of all human fears, because the fear of death tells us that it's going to put a full stop or an end to our lives, to our existence. Therefore, this is one of the biggest fears of humans, or one of the biggest figures concerning human existence. So the fear of death is something that we also need to come to terms with. But before that, let me also tell you that the fear of death is not a negative one only, because it has a positive dimension as well. Because if our fear of death is positively oriented, that means we'll be taking care of our lives, we'll begin to go for exercise, we'll eat healthy, we'll sleep well, and do a variety of things to preserve this life, because this life preservation instinct is an evolutionary need of the humans. So let's take a look at the fear of death from these dimensions. So every time we think of death, so we suddenly get a variety of images in our mind or right in front of our eyes, and this is one such image that tells you that yes, death is lurking somewhere right there. So fear of death is an existential concern which is experienced universally. We all know that it's a universal. There is no one who doesn't experience the fear of death. As we all experience fear, we also experience specific fears as well. And death is one such fear, because we all know, we all become aware of the fact that right from the moment of our birth, this life is moving fast towards the end that is called death. So it's an existential concern, and we all know that the fear of death is quite valid and it's quite natural. So we all experience fear of death. And then we also know that it's a fear of death or fear of the dying process. So it can be death or it can be the dying process. So most researchers think and they agree to the fact that people are far more scared or afraid of the dying process than just death. So death, of course, scares us, frightens us, but it's a dying process that creates a kind of pain sensation in us, and that's the reason why most of us would like to avoid thinking about death or even visualize the dying process. So, but at the same time, I have already talked about it, you also know this very well, that fear of death also gives purpose to our life. Imagine if there were no death, what would happen to this life? We would probably not do anything, because we will continue to believe, continue to think that, okay, we'll do it tomorrow, let's postpone it, let's procrastinate it, and will not attach any meaning to life. Since we know that death will put an end to the enterprise or life's endeavors, we always strive to attach meaning to our life and meaning to our existence. So we all would like to be assured of the fact that we have done something, we have achieved something, we have attached meaning to this life before death comes forward and embraces us. So therefore, death is important because it attaches meaning to our lives. And then fear of death is, as you might be knowing, so it's also referred to as Thanatophobia. But there's a difference between general, everyday, normal fear of death and Thanatophobia. I'll be talking about Thanatophobia in detail after a while. So it's called Thanatophobia because it's a combination of two Greek words, Thanatos and Phobos. So Thanatos is a Greek word for death and Phobos is a Greek word for fear. So therefore, Thanatophobia means the fear of death. And then finally, fear of death actually leads to death anxiety. I just told you that it's quite natural for all of us to experience fear of death. But if that fear of death becomes persistent, it grows in intensity, it grows in frequency, and it grows in duration, then we need to be concerned about it. Because this fear, which is otherwise not harmful, might quickly turn into an anxiety disorder. It can properly turn into a generalized anxiety disorder if we do not take care of it, if we allow our fear of death to promptly turn into death anxiety. So I'll also be focusing on death anxiety in today's lecture. So death anxiety, as I talked about a while ago, is a serious issue. It's a serious problem. Fear of death is not a clinical condition, but death anxiety is, of course, a clinical condition because it leads to dysfunctional existence or dysfunctional everyday existence. So therefore, we need to be very, very careful that we do not move into the realm of death anxiety. So you all know, you are familiar with anxiety. I also talked about anxiety in my last lecture. So it it invades, it attacks us from all the sides, and we are frozen. We do not know what to do and how to take care of those triggers of our anxiety. But we need to do something about those things so that we emerge well, and then we ensure our well-being. So death anxiety, we all know it comes naturally to all of us. It's not very disturbing. It's not very special. It comes to all of us. We all experience death anxiety because we find the thought of death, the very thought of death and dying, unacceptable. I mean, barring just a few people who are either ascetics or who have been able to overcome the fear of death, most of us are scared of the thought of death. Forget alone death itself. We are even scared of, frightened of the thought of death and dying, and we treat them as unacceptable thoughts. Although these thoughts keep coming to us, we do our best to keep them under control, check them, prevent them from invading us or coming to us frequently, repeatedly, but they do come back to us. There are occasions when we are faced with certain death scenes and they come back to us. We cannot stop those thoughts from coming back to us. But it's also a good idea that we need to understand that we live in a death-denying culture. It's a death-denying culture. Our culture tells us that focus in life, do not focus in death. That will come to you naturally. And that's one big reason why most people experience anxiety over death, because they in a way insulate themselves from the thought of death. They do not like to think about death. They just hate death and the thoughts associated with it. So that in fact leads to anxiety and more anxiety. So we need to keep that under check. And then we come to the idea of death anxiety, which is also caused by anxiety caused by death-recent thought content. So death anxiety is also caused by a kind of anxiety that's the result of death-recent thought content. So if you have been recently exposed to a death scene which has created a death thought in you, then there is every possibility that that particular thought will continue to disturb you over a certain period of time. And if you're unable to take care of that particular distressing emotion, there is every possibility that you'll promptly move into the realm of death anxiety. And then when it comes to the elderly people, the aged people, lower ego integrity, physical problems, and psychological problems as well. They are also predictive of higher levels of death anxiety, because people who have physical problems, health issues, they are more likely to experience death anxiety. The elderly people experience lower ego integrity. They are also likely to experience death anxiety. Similarly, if you have psychological problems, you are also likely to experience death anxiety. And then our goals, passions, hobbies, and activities are the coping strategies to face death anxieties. As I told you all that death anxiety is here to disturb us. We cannot prevent it from coming to us. It will keep coming to us. But we create our passions, we create our goals, we create our hobbies, and we engage in activities so that we can use these practices as strong measures to cope with death anxiety. So death anxiety invites certain coping strategies, certain coping approaches from us. So let's take a quick look at the different types of death anxiety. There's one type of death anxiety is existential death anxiety. I have already talked about it. If you remember lecture 1, I talked about existential concerns, and I also began with death, the idea, the thought of death, and Yalom's thought of death as well. So existential death anxiety arises from our understanding, from our realization that our lives will end. Nothing can stop it or prevent it from ending or being ended or coming to an end. So that's the realization, that's the awareness which leads to existential death anxiety. And then predatory death anxiety. So we are also scared, we're also afraid that we'll be harmed. And if that is the case, then that particular anxiety mobilizes our individual adaptive resources and to prepare us for the fight or flight responses. I talked about this particular thing yesterday or in my last lecture. So, and then the final one, that is predation or predator death anxiety. So, a different kind of death anxiety. It arises in us when we harm others physically or mentally. So, this form of death anxiety is often accompanied by unconscious guilt. So, this is a very different kind of death anxiety. And then we come to the idea of thanatophobia. We have taken a look at fear of death, death anxiety, and then we come to thanatophobia. So, as you all know, the fear of death is considered a phobia, but this is an extreme kind of fear. This is a lingering fear. This is a fear that keeps coming back to us frequently and in an intensified manner. So, this is a very different kind of fear. So, the fear of death is considered a phobia or a clinical condition, because a phobia is generally perceived as a clinical condition. So, certain clinical interventions are required to take care of a certain type of phobia. So, if fear of death turns into a clinical condition, it actually turns into a phobia. So, when that happens, what things we can see? So, it arises almost every time a person thinks about dying. So, every time a person thinks about dying, the person is bound to experience that particular phobia. But then, if the frequency of such experience or such thinking increases, then that will certainly lead to a clinical condition. And then, if that particular thought persists for more than 6 months, that means the duration increases. So, for more than 6 months, you continue to experience, continue to think about death. That means it's a clinical condition and it has turned into a phobia or thanatophobia. And then gets in the way of your everyday functioning and your relationships. That means your life will become either dysfunctional or partially functional, and your relations or relationships will be strained. If that is the case, then you need to understand that it is a clinical condition of thanatophobia. And then finally, it begins to interfere with the normal functioning of life. So, the same person who used to manage his or her life in a normal, easy manner would find it extremely difficult, and that will be visible, that will be discernible to people around the person. So, the normal functioning of life will be disturbed substantially. So, these are the indications, these are the signs of thanatophobia. If that happens, then we need to ring the alarm bell that it's an instance of thanatophobia. And now to your take on death. So every time you are asked this question, what do you think about death? What it is according to you? So if this question is asked to a large number of people, the responses will vary slightly, because it's all about how we perceive death. Since it's not an object, it's not a tangible or visible object, we have to perceive, we have to think about it. So every time we perceive death, we do so in a different manner. So let's take a look at how people think about death. So most of us would agree to the fact that death has 1,000 faces. It comes to us in different shapes, in different ways, in different manners. And death is universal, it is ubiquitous and universal. We all have seen, we all know that. And then dying is a very, very hard work. It's not an easy thing. Most people construe the process of dying, and we all know that the process of dying requires a great amount of courage. And that's one big reason, because people think it's a very painful process. That's the reason why most people are scared of it, even are scared of the thought of it, because dying is hard work. It's not an easy task, easy job. And then this is a very important reason. We live in a death-denying culture. It's a death-denying culture because we do not accept the idea of death, the thought of death. Death is also treated as a taboo subject. The moment you begin to talk about death, people will suddenly, they will desert you, they will ask you to stop talking about it. It's a taboo subject. So we do not enjoy, or we do not find it comfortable to talk about death. So that's how we have been the part of a death-denying culture. And then death attitudes affect how we live, and that's the most important thing of it all, because the way we approach the idea of death, that's the death attitude. Whether we think that yes, death is normal, it's natural, it's a natural end to the human enterprise or human existence or human endeavor. If we embrace it, if we accept it as a natural process, then it will not be distressful or disturbing. So it's all about the death attitude that we all carry with us. And then we come to three very different positions, and these ideas are taken from the work of Dr. Wong. So the first is, these ideas are based on Palmer's cross-cultural interview that was conducted in 1993 to develop an insight into how people think about the idea of death differently. So a Zen Buddhist monk accepted death as the shedding of his old skin. See how metaphorically the Buddhist monk has talked about death. He's used a metaphor. It's like shedding of his old skin. So that's death. So therefore, it's not disturbing, it's not painful to the Buddhist monk. So there are some people who think that death is not at all disturbing, it's not painful, and it's not distressing as well. So that's a category. A large number of people think that death and the idea of death should be avoided at any cost. And that's one big reason why people enter into regimes of body training, healthy eating. I don't say these are bad habits, these are good because they serve our life preservation instinct. But at the same time, there is absolutely no need to be so maniac about those activities, because people are so because of this particular reason, this particular standpoint, position. And there is a third position where people think that death is extremely terrifying because it's omnipotent, it's omnipresent, and it's brutally impartial. It doesn't distinguish. And above all of this, it's mysterious. It's absolutely difficult for us to discern. So, these are the three important positions that are generally taken vis-a-vis the idea of death. So, now you can in fact try to identify with any of these ideas, try to understand what exactly has been your standpoint, your position in relation to the idea of death. So that brings us to the idea of coping strategies. Since the fear of death or death anxiety or thanatophobia are serious issues in terms of grading. We start with fear of death, which is not very, very serious, but the moment it turns into death anxiety, it becomes serious. And then we come to the idea of thanatophobia. When that happens, we need certain coping strategies. So these are certain coping strategies that we can adopt in order to take care of death. When it comes to coping strategies, I must tell you all that there are two very important coping strategies. One is problem-focused coping strategy, in which people try to change the stressful situation, and then that is how they alter the source of their stress. And there is the emotion-focused coping that aims at managing the emotions. Since you know that you cannot change the situation, the best thing that you can do is to manage the situation itself emotionally, so that you know how to cope with it. Okay? That brings us to the poetic composition that I talked about at the beginning of today's lecture. And as I told you then that we're going to focus on very carefully chosen and important texts that have a great deal of message for each one of us, and they are going to help us with wonderful coping skills. So let's take a quick look at Death Be Not Proud by Donne. So when you take a look at the title itself, you can easily understand that somebody is being addressed to by somebody else. So there is a speaker who is addressing a listener, and the speaker is somebody here, and the listener is Mr. Death. So how does the listener become a person? We all know that death is an abstract idea. It's an abstract concept. So with the help of personification strategy, personification is a wonderful, wonderful skill. If you remember, I talked about personification in detail while talking about rhetoric and prosody. If you have gone through that lecture, you'll be fine with the idea of personification. So with the help of personification, the speaker tries to create an image of death, converts death into a person who is not as frightening, as scary, or as powerful as the idea of death has been painted to be. So with the help of personification and a variety of other strategies, the speaker has tried to launch a fight against death, and he is extremely successful in doing that. So I'll show you how these skills and strategies have been employed with a great amount of success. So when we go through these lines, we'll promptly discover the fact that the speaker is addressing death as a person, and while doing so, the speaker is trying to downsizing death. So this is a very, very important strategy, coping strategy that we employ in order to, manage an invisible enemy who is extremely powerful, scary, and frightening. So that's the strategy the speaker has employed here. And in order to do so, you need the skill of personification. I must tell you all that personification is a wonderful skill. It's a very, very important skill that we all need in our times. So when we look at this, we start with the idea of death. So death has been personified, and death is being warned. So be not proud. There is absolutely no need for you to be proud. So some people have called you mighty and dreadful. You are treated to be mighty, powerful and scary by some people, and that's very, very important. If you say everyone treats you, that means you are surrendering. Some people, that means there are many others who do not treat you as mighty and dreadful, and I am probably one of them. So this is exactly what will give you that much needed confidence, courage to stand face to face with death. And then this denying of that position to death, you're not so don't be proud about it. There are some people who think that you are mighty and dreadful, and that doesn't give you any right to feel that you are omnipotent and omnipresent. So do not be proud about it. And then how death has been belittled and downsized. So downsizing is a wonderful skill, I told you, with the help of which you can manage your enemy, who is, of course, stronger than you. So downsizing is the skill that is being employed here. Poor death, or poor wretched fellow death. So you are powerless, you are a poor fellow. You don't have to be proud. So, and then there are the tropes that are used to, replace the idea of death. That's also a very, very important skill. So if you look at the idea of tiger, the moment we use this word tiger, we say the word tiger, now the image of a ferocious animal promptly comes to our minds, or flashes right in front of our eyes. Now when William Blake talked about tiger from a different perspective, he was not pointing towards the ferocity of the animal. He was in fact pointing towards the mysteriousness of that animal. Therefore he changed the spelling and used a very different trope, different strategy. He used the spelling T-Y-G-E-R. Similarly, A. Milne used the idea of tiger by downsizing it. He calls it tigger, T-I-G-G-E-R, tigger. So that is how these tropes are used in order to downsize. So instead of talking about death, now the speaker is talking about rest and sleep. So these are also the forms of death, and they are far more palatable forms of death than the idea of death itself. So by focusing on the more palatable forms of death, the speaker is in fact trying to downsize. And then these are the pictures, your pictures. And then we come to the next stage, where we see again the use of a word that downsizes the position of death. Poor death, now you are a slave. You are nothing more than just a slave. You are a slave to all these things. So therefore, why are you so proud? You are poor, you are powerless, you are a slave. So there is absolutely no need for you to be powerful. And then the final warning, why swellest you then? That means, why are you swelling with pride? You don't deserve it. You don't have any right to be proud of your omnipotence, because you're not so. And then the final trope, one short sleep past, we wake eternally. So instead of talking about death, the speaker uses the idea of sleep twice to reaffirm. Rest and sleep, now sleep. One short sleep past, we wake eternally. So, and that's exactly where acceptance lies. You accept the fact that yes, death is a fact. So remember the Zen Buddhist monk, acceptance is a key to overcoming your fear, your anxiety. Because the moment you accept, that will give you a plan, a strategy to start working on your problems. And then finally says, death thou shalt die. You not live. So that's the final pronouncement. And that is how we can now take a look at the various coping skills and strategies employed in this particular literary composition, which is a wonderful, wonderful work, and that has been, fascinating the readers for ages now. So acceptance, as I told you, is key to overcoming the problems. For example, I have a problem. The moment I accept, yes, I have a problem, that will give you strength and confidence to start working on that problem. If you run into a denial mode, no, I don't have a problem, and then I have a problem, but I do not want to accept that I have one, that will lead to problems. So the speaker accepts that yes, death is the ultimate reality, but it's not as frightening or scary as it is painted to be. And then talking therapy, we all know that talking is therapy. So when you begin to talk about the problems that you're facing, when you begin to talk about the ways you're employing or adopting in order to overcome that problem, all these things are going to give you certain therapeutic results. So talking is therapy. That's exactly what the speaker is doing here. And then personification, I have told you, personification is a wonderful coping skill. We can easily personify. If you remember, while talking about rhetoric and prosody, I talked about anxiety personification. So you can always personify and then see what lies right in front of you. And then downsizing, it's a huge coping skill or coping strategy that we all can use in order to minimize or belittle our enemy so that it doesn't turn out to be scary enough. Now, this is a wonderful coping skill that this particular literary composition, in fact, communicates to us, teaches us perspective shift. So, if you shift the perspective from the problem to the solution, then you can actually think about the solution. So, if you shift the perspective from fear to the acceptance of it, to confidence, to courage, then that will help you. And that's exactly what is happening in this poetic composition. So, from fear, the speaker is shifting the perspective to courage. So, perspective shift is a very important skill that this poem teaches us. And then this is a very, very important skill, terror management. So we all know that we all have this evolutionary design of self-preservation instinct. We all have self-preservation instinct. But at the same time, we also understand, realize that death will put an end to this existence, this life. This particular thing creates a conflict. And because of this conflict between the idea of death and the self-preservation instinct, we experience terror. And that's exactly what is happening in this poem. So, people experience terror, and that's why the use of the word mighty and dreadful. Dreadful because it terrorizes. So, and how do you manage terror? To manage terror, all you have to do, there are two ways of managing terror. First, you escape or you engage. So the speaker decides to engage in certain value systems, certain cultural beliefs. And that's the reason why he says that some people think that you're mighty and dreadful. That means many others do not think that you are mighty and dreadful. I belong to that community. So he tries to find or posit his faith in the practice of that community. So he is actually doing terror management. So this is very popularly called terror management theory. And then finally, if you have taken a look at the form, that's a sonnet form, it's a sonnet. If you take a look at the sonnet form, you'll find that the sonnet form is in fact is symbolic of the eros instinct. Because in sonnets, we generally talk about life and love. So, the eros instinct, which is quite prominent in this poetic composition, is preserved. by his attempt to take on death and to downsize death and to overcome death. So these are some of the coping skills and strategies that we find when we approach this particular poetic composition, Death, Be Not Proud by John Donne. So you can also take another look, a fresh look at the poem, and it may happen that you come out with something different, a different coping skill or strategy that has been employed by the speaker. So what I mean to say is, every time we come across such compositions, we return wiser. And in order to do so, we need to engage in the processes. Because of this embodied simulation, we see somebody doing something, fighting, making decisions, so we begin to engage in that process. So when we also begin to engage, we also do the same things simultaneously. So that's how this particular composition teaches us how to take care of our death anxiety. And that's how we come to the end of this lecture. So thank you very much for joining me. In my next lecture, I'm going to talk about decision-making anxiety. Thank you.